Everybody. It's nice to see people here for the last seminar of term. So my name is Tina Fawcett and I'm the academic convener of the. Before introducing today's speaker, I'm just going to give you a couple of adverts for things that are happening in future with the network. This is the last, as we said, this is the last seminar for this term. We'll be starting again next term with a whole series of events, which you will see about in all the places where you hear about seminars, but also if you sign up to our newsletter, you'll get a advance notice of those. But next term's theme is going to be the future of energy. So all of the speakers who speak will reflect on, their topic and the future of energy. So we're hoping to start with one which is looking at future energy scenarios of what they have been in the past, what they are now. There'll also be other specialist topics like science, social science, various different topics that people are speaking on that will hopefully add up to a sort of vision of an energy future by the end of term. That's what we're hoping for. Two other events to mention. This is very short notice, but tomorrow, if you haven't heard about it, the Zero Institute are running an Industry Meets Academia Day. If you want to know about that, if you go to zero.ox.ac.uk, I'm sure you can still sign up. Well, I imagine you can. And a bit more notice is for the Termly Energy Lunch, which again is organised between ourselves and the Institute. That will be on Monday, the 23rd of March, 1 to 3 p.m. at the University Club, which is just down there on Mansfield Road, free to attend, genuine free lunch, come and network with energy type people. So everybody is very welcome to that. Okay. So now let's move on to today's speaker. So today we've got Dr. Bernie Jones, as you'll see. Bernie's the founder and managing director of Smart Villages, having previously co-led the 7 years Smart Villages Initiative research project that's looked at technologies, business models, policies and opportunities and barriers to energy access globally. And this fits really nicely. If you were here last week, that was also about energy access, and particularly in Nigeria in that case. Bernie's done lots of other interesting things before coming to this, including leading the international work of the Royal Society, which is the UK Academy of Sciences, and also ran the European and global networks of science academies and academies of medical sciences. And lots of experience in this sector for a long time, which he may tell us more about. So over to you, sir.
Thanks very much for that. And it's great to be here. Yes, it's kind of a random arc, but it's been fun. And yes, it's been quite fun to reinvent myself ever so often. And I should say that the co-founder of the Smart Villages Initiative is John Holmes, who is here as well. And so he and I ran that research initiative before he very sensibly decided that he'd had enough and wanted to retire. Because I was younger, I thought, all right, I've got to do something with the rest of my life. I thought, right, let's found the company and see where we get to with it. So thanks now. Click it was hard, but it is. Right, let's go for the keyboard, because that's cool.
A minute. Tested it. Typical.
We can do it with a mouse. Right. So as John reminded me when he realised that we've been invited here to do this, it's particularly appropriate that we're here because this was where the whole Smart Villages idea kind of started right here at the ECI back in 2011. So John was running the energy work of ESAC, that European network of science academies. And so we delivered science advice to the European institutions. And DG DevCo, the Directorate General that does development, said to us, look, can you do something on energy access for us? Because it's dead easy for us to fund a €5 billion project to build a hydroelectric dam somewhere in Africa. But if we want to do stuff for the villages, we can't fund €100 investments because just the granularity of that doesn't make sense. So please have a look and see what's out there and see how we can engage with this super important field. So John put together this idea for a scoping study to look into village level energy access. And Jim Hall helped him find 3 people that had just finished their master's degree here. So that was where it all started 15 years ago. So you should give yourselves a pat on the back for everything that we've done since then. So that then developed into this idea of energy access at the community level is really interesting, but it had some kind of flaws to it. We saw in that scoping study that there was this really interesting combination between the technologies that were being used, but then obviously because you need to get those technologies to lots and lots of people in lots and lots of very remote villages, so you can't rely on charities or governments to do that. You need the private sector to get involved, and the energy entrepreneurs are getting involved there. So then there's a question of, right, how does the technology work with the energy entrepreneurs? How do those business models work? How do the funders then support that? How can governments create a sort of sensible structure for that to all operate in? So that got us interested in then looking into this on a much bigger basis, and then looking at what are the impacts, because nobody kind of just wants energy. You want the energy to do something with. And now we all nod and say, well, yes, of course. But at the time, this whole idea of productive use was still relatively unknown, and people were just kind of terribly excited by the actual energy widgets and not really do. So people were really surprised when you came up with all these solar home systems in the village, and not very much happened by magic by itself. So those were still the early days of looking into productive use. So we then thought, well, actually, just the energy thing by itself isn't really enough for impact. You need to try and look at how that can then impact all the other areas of people's lives, and try and have it more cross-cutting across all the different sustainable development goals. And then that was also a time where everybody was terribly excited with smart cities, and we did a little check, and in the first year that we started looking into this then properly, there was something like 100 smart cities conferences all around the world, and that was lovely. Everybody was getting really excited by those. And our thesis was, well, half the world's population doesn't live in cities, and most of the world's poor people certainly don't live in cities. So should we not look at smart villages as well? And is the technology in a state where actually it can then be the catalyst for letting these smart villages be able to access all the sorts of services that they want to over there, miles away from the city? So that led to the Slightly initiative, where I and lots of colleagues of ours worked all around the world, bringing together stakeholders. We ran like 40 different workshops, bringing together stakeholders, issues, talk about the new technologies, the direction, the trajectory that technology development is taking, where there were problems, where there were opportunities. We ran a load of other things. We ran a webinar series. We ran something like 6 or 7 different entrepreneurship competitions around the world. Just sort of drumming up general interest in energy access. From that, we came up with a whole load of conclusions, which are our findings report, which is still on our website, should you wish to read it. And John laboured for many months to write that, and it's still scarily relevant now, 10 years later, because not a huge amount has changed. Some things have changed, but not everything. But one of the interesting things that we got into at the end of that, towards the end of that initiative, was looking at failure and why so many projects failed. And sometimes it was the technologies failing, but usually it failed because people hadn't involved the communities properly. So you came up with a brilliant idea yourself for a piece of technology, you brought it to a village, and to everybody's intense surprise, it didn't do what you wanted it to do. And of course, that's because the people hadn't involved the communities to start with to find out what they actually wanted. And also, was there no kind of empowerment of those communities or training of them to be able to maintain systems or feel a sense of ownership for them, a sense of governance over them. So communities then didn't kind of particularly feel that this system which had been installed there was there. So if it did break, they were like, oh, well, let's go back to the old ways. And if it did break and nobody had told them how to fix it, of course, then there was nothing that could be done. So of the many conclusions that we came up with at the end of that research project, it was this integrated story. Don't just do energy and all the other things that needs, because otherwise it won't actually meet their requirements. And what you risk then is you risk like 5 different projects coming into a community which are each trying to do something different. And their solutions all don't work with each other, or in fact sort of interfere with each other to a net detriment of the community rather than to benefit them. So try and do stuff that's integrated to start with. And then the other thing is do everything bottom up instead of top down. So involve the communities, which doesn't sound like rocket science, but kind of was. And we went round then to lots of funders and said, well, here's what we found. They said, wow, that sounds great. And we said, so you're going to do that? And they said, no, we can't possibly do things like that. So why not? Well, all of our funding, they said, you have to understand, is very siloed. And yeah, we were sitting in the World Bank in Washington. They said, no, we can't do that. I said, but look, over the corridor, there's the agric department and your energy. Can't you just like talk to them and do one project together? No, that's not the culture here. So after we finished banging our head at the wall, and John then said, see you, I'm retiring. We said, right, the only way we're going to do this is to try and demonstrate it ourselves. So that's when we then set up the company and looked for ways to demonstrate, first of all, that integrated approach and trying to show how that could work in villages. These are the sorts of principles that we were working by as a result of that research, trying not to do the one-dimensional development, do stuff that's long-term sustainable, do a lot more on data impact, because again, at that time, the impact measurement of all of these projects was how many kilowatt hours have you generated or how many systems have you given away, neither of which tells you the single thing about how useful it is to the community. So this idea that actually the impact of an energy project should be, right, what's your educational outcomes in 5 years' time, what's your health outcomes in 5 years' time, we're still novel. And in fact, I'd argue that it's still pretty novel now, because you still don't have anybody actually funding you to do that long-term follow-up. But anyway, those are the sorts of things we did. But what was interesting about that then, when we started getting various projects and being able to demonstrate this in the field, is that you very rapidly find that when you're then trying to build creative sort of integrated system that does more than one thing at the same time, and it does more than the things that the equipment has actually been designed to do in the first place, you realize that 95% of your components you can get off the shelf, 5% don't exist. So we rapidly then got into technology innovation as well. So as well as trying to innovate the system and innovate how you integrate this to do a solution and innovate how you work with the communities, we then started to get more into innovating the technologies or putting existing technologies to slightly novel uses to get them to try and do things that they weren't actually designed to do, but in practical terms could do once you're in the field. So since 2017, we've done more than 30 projects, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, 1 or 2 in Southeast Asia as well, around a range of things. So we call ourselves now an impact innovation company, which comes up with solutions, technology solutions, devices technology solutions which will lead to the long-term sustainable impact in a community. So the technology is kind of the catalyst for that. It's not the be-all and end-all of it. Often energy is a catalyst, which is why we're here, but there are other catalysts as well. So ICT, for example, is a big catalyst to try and make that work. So most of what we've done relates to off-grid community energy systems and how to use those to also get access to water, health and education. Here's a funny one. So productive use, everybody's right on top of productive uses and say how super important they are. So you put an energy system in a village that hasn't had one before. You said, this is great because with the energy, you can now start up lots of businesses. And then you come back 2 years later and to your surprise, there aren't lots of new businesses. And the reason, nobody's told the community how to run a business. And here we are at Oxford University and you've got a nice incubator down the road and every single university in the world has now got its own incubation centre. So very clever students and researchers here need an incubation centre to help them set up a business. How are we expecting people in the world's poorest communities to do it by magic without actually giving them a bit of advice, a bit of pointer and a bit of investment to start up little micro businesses? So we've got into sort of village enterprise incubation as well, to help people actually set up the new businesses that will let them actually use the energy that they now have from the systems. And then, so most off-grid rural communities of the world are involved in agriculture. So the nexus to agriculture is probably one of the most important ones, and one of the most important ways that they can generate more funding is by doing the agricultural value addition, and then environment and resilience are also super important. And this is a very nice, very complicated diagram, which I did for a presentation last year. I left it in there just because I like the diagram, but we don't need to go through it too much. But it's basically to say, look, we start with the community engagement and then go through the co-creation with the community of that solution. And then all the different bits that go into that, trying to create the new enterprises, upskilling the community, doing things with them. And then trying to generate the impact, and then going round in the circle to say, right, once we've got that, then you can now community do more, reinvest anything that you're making and scale those systems into the future. So here is our general approach for how we now work in projects. So we try to always be community led. So we only ever work with local partners, which is different from some of the other companies in our space, because so my staff are almost all UK based. But the way that we do that local work is we always have a local partner who are very often community NGOs, but sometimes they're just local companies in those other countries. So we always work with them. So we get that local context. We always work with communities. We try and do a skills and capacity transfer to our partners, to those communities. And by the way, that comes back as well. We've learned an awful lot from those communities and from those partners at the same time. And we always try to maintain those relationships in the long term. And I'll get into this a little bit later, because one of the many problems in this sector is that all of the funding that you get is very short. So if your grant is only for 2 years, realistically, the bit of kit that you're building and deploying in a community isn't going to actually get done until at least 1 year into those 2 years. So then you only have 1 year to test it. And then the traditional model is you say bye-bye, and the thing stays on the ground, and cross your fingers and you hope that it will continue to work into the long term, but you have no way of actually finding out whether that happens. But because we're working with local partners who are still there, we're able to maintain that contact. And I was talking to somebody this morning. She was asking me what the difference was between us and, say, charities that work in place. And in some ways, our approach is a little bit like a charity's in that we try to work for the impact, not just for the bottom line. But I was saying, I think it's probably that we, as a company, as a private company, we can slightly guide our own progress. So we can apply for projects to do a particular thing in a particular place, whereas maybe if you're a charity, you don't have quite that power to direct yourself. You're more reliant on what the funders want you to do. So one of the other ways that we maintain our relationship with those communities is that we then try to follow up and do another project in the same community. So we might be doing something else, but it's still in that community. So while we're in that community doing that other thing, we can make sure that the first system is still working. And that does one of a number of things. It means that the communities see that we are still around. And usually when we've come in and said, hi, we'd like to work with you, and it's a two-way thing, we don't then disappear a year later, never to be seen again. We are still every couple of months coming down and say, hi, you remember us? Yeah. So that builds up a degree of trust, and they can see that we're still working towards maintaining the other original things and doing stuff. So that is a really powerful way of maintaining that relationship with the community and maintaining the trust. And that actually goes a long way in terms of we then can't come for a couple of months, or we can't do something immediately, because we've been coming for so long. They then trust that we will eventually come back, rather than saying, oh, well, forget these comedians from the UK, we're never going to see them again. So that's really good. But there's something even more powerful than that, which is if you are now starting a new project to try and do something new in a new community, you've got two ways of doing that. You can do the traditional method is you breeze in, you say, hi, we're here from Oxford, we're here to help. Here's a wonderful piece of kit that we've devised, and the community say, what on earth is this? And it doesn't work, and everybody's very surprised and goes home. The other way is you say, no, we want to do our community engagement properly, but then it takes you 6 months of sitting on the ground with them, talking about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, before you can even start designing your equipment and starting to install it. And that takes time. We've got communities that know us and trust us, so we can pretty much do that from the get-go. We don't have to waste 6 months establishing that relationship because we've already got it. So I, slightly tongue-in-cheek, now say all of those communities that we've worked with since 2017, 2019 are essentially our research labs. And I now know I can apply for a project. Well, we are applying for projects this week to do some new technology development. So, right, we'll do it in these communities because I know that we can do that in those communities and that they'll trust us that it's not going to make their houses catch fire. But that they will understand what we're doing, and they will work together with us, make it work, and that we can rely on them to be able to maintain the systems and operate them when we're not there. So that's a super powerful thing for us as innovators as well. And final thing, the service value test is just the way that we have of originally engaging with communities. What's a bit different about that is that a lot of people talk about trying to find out community needs. But community needs are a very long list. And if you talk to communities about what their needs are, you don't necessarily get something that's very helpful for you as an organisation trying to work with them, because those needs will be everything from we'd like some light to we'd like a better road. There's only a given number of things that you can do in your project, even if you're trying to be cross-cutting. So we have this service value test that was developed by one of our colleagues, Anna Clements, in a PhD in engineering here in Oxford as well, several years ago, which doesn't just look at needs, it looks at priorities, which turns out to be quite a subtly different thing. So first we have groups of different sectors of community. You can do it with youth, you do it with women, do it with men. You talk about all the things. What are the services you'd like to see in the community? They talk about what they'd like to see and why they'd like it and why it's important for them. But then you force them to prioritize and basically give them all 20 counters and say, all right, we've got a map of these 12 services. Now prioritize those just individually. You've got your 20 counters, put those on these different services, depending on what you think is the most important. So if you think just having water access is the most important thing, you don't care so much about everything else, put all 20 counters on that square. Alternatively, if you think these 5 things are most important, share it out like that. And that turns out to be a super powerful way of saying, right, here's all the things that they need. Here's the 5 that they prioritize. And then you can characterize those things by various different metrics. So women's preference is an obvious one. If the women like one group of things and the men don't, and you want to do things that will be good for the women in the community, then you can slant your design of systems towards that. But then you could also rank the different services by the near-term economic benefit. So is it actually going to benefit the community in the short term? And ease of delivery, like how much it's going to cost, how feasible is it going to be? So building a new road is going to be super expensive and incredibly hard to do, whereas I don't know, putting a milling machine in or a fridge is going to be super easy. And that means you then have a really good way of trying to decide which things you are going to try and include in a new system, in a new kind of integrated approach, or which ones are kind of too difficult for now. But what's then powerful is we write this up in a report and take it back to the community, and that's really good for them, because then if you can't, assuming that we can't build them a new road, they still then have a nice report that they can then take to their local government or whoever else to say, actually, we did this exercise in the community, some other things that those guys couldn't do. These show what our community priorities are. So you now, a local government, could try and do some of those other things. So it's quite good. We found it's quite good for communities, not just a good way for us to be able to figure out what they really want us to do. And then we go through this whole way of working with the communities once we get started to and come up with integrated systems and work together with them, support them to be able to then operate the things and fix them and understand how they're working so that they can then change it to the future or upgrade it. And some of the examples, just over the years, type of things that we've done. So we've done lots and lots of projects, research novel productive uses, and do that entrepreneurship incubation that we talked about. We've kind of worked through all the various bits of the technology of an energy generation system. So we've looked at, because when we started, it was really hard to get high quality mountings for solar panels in these remote places. So we looked at novel ways to mount the solar panels to be reliable, but to be low cost. We've done projects to improve how inverters can be connected together so that they can supply peak loads without that being cost inefficient. We are doing projects on localizing battery production in Africa, which then also means that you could fix them in Africa, maintain them, so that things don't break, and then you're on the phone to the manufacturers for 3 months while they fail to sort out your problems. We've got projects on efficient water access and productive uses to do with water. We've done some biogas and productive use of biogas projects as well. And at the moment, the most techie one that we've done is we're doing a project on using low voltage single wire earth return systems to distribute power to households. So that's just using one cable. The return path goes through the soil, which is fine to do because when you're only powering a 3-watt bulb, there's not a lot of current in the system. You wouldn't do it in your house, but there it's a much cheaper way of doing it. And my favorite stat that I use to support that project is one of the villages we work in Uganda is the same size as my village here in Oxfordshire. It has 1/5 of the number of people. The energy costs that we pay are roughly the same per kilowatt hour. Our houses use an average of 10 kilowatt hours a day. Their houses, if we're lucky, will use like 50 watt hours a day, maybe 100 watt hours a day. Because the traditional way of doing a mini grid distribution system is you build everything to grid standard. Grid poles, grid wires, grid connections, grid meter. And that means that in Sutton Courtenay, near Abingdon, where I live, we pay for our entire distribution system around the village in about 3 weeks of power use. In Uganda, it'll take them 30 years to pay back the cost of the cables that are connecting the houses. Never mind paying for the system that actually generates the energy, just the cables that are connecting them, which is one of the many reasons why mini grids aren't economically viable when they're not subsidized. But things like that SWER approach is us trying to say, all right, can we think of a slightly different way to do things? So that was a very long intro. So now there's a set of my rants. So I'm going to try and make it not ranty. But here are the issues that we've kind of seen in our work and the way that the energy access story and environment business is working at the moment, and what it means for our ability to be community centric in that. The first problem, I think, is that energy access has now come to be seen as an investment opportunity, funding and impact opportunity. And that's partly due to the fact that the central government and philanthropic funding has deteriorated as aid budgets have been cut, especially during COVID. But it's also that there's been a bit of a pile on in the investment community, and they've seen a couple of opportunities and investments succeed. So everybody's now wanting to invest in this because it's seen as the next, well, they think it's the next gold rush, because you see these stats saying, oh yeah, energy access is worth however many billion it is. And I keep saying, right, if you want to make money in Africa, they invest in a mobile phone company or in a brewery, but not in energy. If you want to have impact, invest in energy, but the two things don't go together. So here's why that's a problem. Because as soon as you make it an investment opportunity, you're forcing everybody to chase the low-hanging fruit, go for those easy to reach communities and ignore the ones that are more expensive and more difficult and further away. It makes people go for cheap solutions. So the number of systems that we've seen that are just too small, but they're cheap, and they'll work to an extent, but then they'll the battery will run out halfway through the night, or you add another 3 houses to the community. It always happens, by the way. You bring energy to a community, everybody says, hey, that's really cool. That community's got energy. We want to move into that community and build more houses. And then, surprise, surprise, there's not enough energy for those extra 100 houses that come into the community. You don't want to do the messy work of having to design something new for every single community. So use a standard design and you dump it on the ground everywhere. And surprise, surprise, different communities are different. Some of them want irrigation, some of them want crop processing. So the single design doesn't work. And you don't want to do anything that's messy. You don't want to do anything that's complicated, like talking to the communities and trying to change how one thing works because they want something slightly different. Speed's more important than impact. We get in there, build it, start charging them money as soon as possible. But that just doesn't work because you have to take the time for the communities to, if they've never had energy before, there's a lot of understanding community needs to be able to do things with that energy. Grant funding is ever shrinking, which means that investment kind of priorities dominate, so people do less interesting new stuff. There's the only people acting loudly and say do something really simple and really small. Yeah, impact investing. There's a reason that I put the quotes around the impact. I think the majority of the impact investors are basically wanting to make themselves sound cooler than they really are, which is why they put impact in front of their names. I've only ever met 2 organizations that are genuinely in it for the impact to say, we don't really mind if we don't get a return here. Everybody else is still chasing the same return that they would if they didn't have the word impact in front of their names. They just make themselves sound shinier by putting the impact there. And if you've got an ever shrinking grant base to start developing things, the investors that want something that's super successful that you've deployed in tens of thousands and you've got a whole sort of good scaling strategy, what there's no funding for is the bit in the middle, which is getting it from a feasibility study where you know that you've got a really interesting product or a really interesting solution, but you haven't got it to that scale where people might even be interested in having a look at it. There's no money at all for that middle bit. So that's what making this a private sector story does to the ability to do things for communities. Here's something else about investors. They love widgets and not complexity. So that means that something that you come up with that's a good idea. I mean, I can come up with something I can come up with an idea for a piece of kit that will $20. I can get a factory in China to make it in tens of thousands, and I can ship that into countries in Africa or in Asia. And we could probably, with a bit of grant funding, manage to distribute tens of thousands in the communities. And I could then go to an investor and say, hey, look at this, it's really cool. We've got all these deployed. But it's still not quite what the communities want. And it's certainly not what they'll want if they start using a bit more power or start doing something different, because it'll be completely non-modifiable and non-scalable. But it'll be incredibly popular for investors to go for. That is the problem that you see. And something that is really simple and just does one thing, one-dimensional, will be much more popular than something big that has more impact. And that will, of course, lead in turn. Initially, you can have lots of adoption by distributing the cheap stuff widely, but then you'll run out of people willing to take it off you, which is why you'll see in the investment story there are quite a lot of failures, a lot of bankruptcies where people have just been overinvested. Because again, there's been a pile-on. As soon as one investor goes in, it looks a bit successful. Everybody else tries to invest, and they're overinvested. They're trying to do base is too high, they crash, and it just ends up not having the impact that you want it to have. Here's something else. Investors love apps and not infrastructure. I've got a couple of fun stories here. One of our friends from Uganda who builds quite big gasification systems and connects them and to community energy systems won a 3-month kind of Californian venture capital training course. So we went over there, and at the end of that 3-month training course as to how to run a business, they got to pitch to all these California VCs. And the question that he got was, where's the app? There isn't an app. I'm working in villages in the middle of Uganda. I'm building these huge systems. There has to be an app. There's not an app, but people love apps. We had I was at a conference a couple of years ago in Cape Town talking to a guy who was building little solar kiosks in Nigeria, which were charging people's phones and torches. And in the course of his pitch that he did, he said, and we've got this app, look, it shows us how much power all these kiosks are using. And I went up to him afterwards and said, why have you got an app? He said, oh yeah, it's completely useless, isn't it? The grant funders said they wanted an app, so I built an app. So that's where we are. And yeah, infrastructure. We were a couple of years ago, we were successful in winning a Africa Power, which was funded by USAID as was, grant to put a big power system in a refugee camp in Uganda and build a mini grid off the back of that, because this refugee camp didn't have any energy and they wanted to provide access to energy to the population there. And so lots of us applied, and our bid with a Ugandan partner was successful. And then we entered into discussions with them, and they said, yeah, you can't build any structures though with this grant. What do you mean you can't build any structures? Yeah, no, you can't build anything that's like on the ground. You can't build any buildings. So, well, how are you going to build a mini grid without a building? Because literally the point of the mini grid was there was a building with a mini grid on top of it, and you had lots of shops in that building. I said, well, you just can't do it under this sort of grant funding. I said, well, what about a pole? Is that straight? No, you can't build poles either. So how can you have a mini grid grant where you can't build anything? So they said, all right, let's have a think about this. So then they went away and spoke to USAID, and they got some funding from a different bit of USAID, which turned out to only be able to build structures, but wouldn't pay any salaries or wouldn't pay for any community engagement. It's like, how stupid can you be? But yeah, so there we go. So a lot of money gets wasted on what investors and people in the industrial world think is shiny. And there's lots of other stupid. So another good example here in the middle. Something that ideally every single mini grid needs is a smart meter, right? Because you want to be able to meter, if you're charging customers for power, you want to be able to meter whatever each household is using. So we had 3 or 4 companies, most of them British, that built smart meters, which were really quite good. And now they don't build smart meters because it turns out it's quite expensive to build smart meters. And you can make a lot more money if you just stick with the internet monitoring platform for the smart meters. So 2 of the 3 now just do the platforms. So we now only have 2 sources of smart meters. One is a company that makes ones that frankly don't work. And the other ones are the generic ones that we get from China that work with the platforms. And thank goodness somebody is making smart meters that work, because those are the ones that we now use. We've got some shiny platforms, but no actual competitor smart meters. Yeah, that monetization and scaling is at odds with impact, because the investors drive you to do speed rather than the quality. Regulations and standards. John will be banging his head into the wall because this was one of our original findings, that there should be better and more permissive regulations, but they still aren't there. They're still barriers and not enablers. And that's because the people talking to regulators in country, consultants that are advising them to set up their regulations, the kind of lawyers saying, no, you have to do it like this, all very complicated and very high quality. Whilst the developers are saying, well, no, let's try and do something that actually works and do it quickly. And those 2 things, again, don't work together. Subsidy is still a dirty word now, and you have to bear in mind that basically all of our power systems here are essentially subsidised. All those initial investments in the national grid were made by government subsidies, so it's entirely unreasonable to expect the world's poorest communities to pay for an entire set of infrastructure in their communities by themselves. There we are. And yeah, so when you do get subsidy, it then turns into things like super complicated carbon credits, which don't work. But really, the benefit there is to the third parties that are devising and managing these things rather than to the end users. Everything is still super short term, which means that you can't engage with the community properly. And importantly, you can never do the follow up and you can never gather the impact data because that certainly takes time. And the impact metrics, like we said before, are too simplistic. So there's all sorts of things that still aren't done very well. All the attention that people pay to preventive uses, most people still don't really have a handle on how that works. People don't work properly with local partners. People don't do that priority and needs analysis first. People tend not to like local solutions. They'd rather import something super complicated, you know how it works, rather than trying to work with local people to come up with their own solution to solve a new challenge. Those local supply chains, then the capacity building of local skills very often isn't there, and there's no long-term follow-up. So here's one of our successes that we just crow about. So this is basically, that was an early photo of it. It's a big old building with a cold store in the middle and then lots of shops around it. It has mini grid scale stuff on the roof, and we've now extended that power out to all of those shops in the centre. But it has all of that multi-metric impact. It used the local supply chain. All the bricks were made by people in the local community who were very proudly then, their certificates to say they had been trained how to make bricks, which was the first qualification they'd ever got in their whole lives. So they were super proud of them. So when we're then encouraged to take this to investors, they're saying, right, so tell us about your thing. They said, well, it's a smart agri centre and it costs $150,000 to build. And that's the point that their eyes glaze over. They said, well, how many have you built? I said, well, 4, and they're really cool. We've got lots of good data from them. And then say, right, here's somebody with a $20 widget that's done 1,000 of them. We're going to invest in that because that'll be easy. Whereas your thing sounds super complicated. We could only do that, by the way, because it was classed as a pilot. If we'd known what we were going to do at the start and applied for the permits under the traditional regulations for mini grids, because this was in Uganda, we'd still be waiting for the permit now. We'd have never built anything. But because we could build it just as building start, and then we did a pilot, talking to the local government, saying, well, we'd now like to try connecting that to some surrounding households. We were able to actually do it. And now retrospectively, we've said, oh, actually, we've done this now. It's really cool. Look at all this benefit. Can we now retrospectively have the permit to sell electricity to these people? And so now we're getting that. Whereas if we've done it the proper way, never got off the ground. One of the funders for that at one stage did ask for an impact audit, which they got inexplicably the World Food Programme to do. What the World Food Programme knows about energy in rural Uganda, I don't know. And the woman came along, was super annoyed that in this community on top of a mountain, there wasn't a Wi-Fi signal for her to do her unconnected Zoom meeting halfway through the day that she could do. And then the one thing that she protested at was that there appeared to be child labour going on because the welding shop that had opened up had a 14-year-old kid from the community learning how to be a welder. And that was child labour. The fact that the 14-year-old kid otherwise wouldn't have been going to school anyway, because there isn't a school there, or would have just been hanging around at home, doing nothing at all, didn't really apply. So still one or two issues in the overall system, but things like this, we believe, are a better way to go, even if they are more complicated and they're not sexy for. So what would we like to see in the sector? I think reasonably to time. So we'd like to see people really putting communities at the centre of what they do. We'd like to see a reverse trend of declining grant funding. We think funding should have tails for impact. So you know, by all means, do a 2-year-long grant, but then put another 20,000 in that grant 5 years later, somebody to come back and do an impact study or fix the bit that's broken. I think still more holistic thinking in government, not so much in funding government, but the local government. So if the Ministry of Energy, Uganda, spoke to the Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education, they could all put together programs between themselves then that use this integrated approach. Putting more money into the solution than into the broker. So you all know what sustainable energy for all is, I assume, the UN SDG 7 thing. So the latest meeting that we went to, which was in Barbados, strangely, had, I think, 4 actual developers at it, and about 50 finance people. So, like I said, everybody's now terribly excited with the finance side, and you had finance people talking to finance people, but nobody actually then talking about how you get to build the stuff on the ground, which is what it eventually will come down to. And that gap didn't really seem to occur to people there. I still think the best way to ensure genuine universal energy access, rather than all of this top-down stuff, would be to just say, right, anybody that connects a household to energy at a certain level, we'll give you a $400 subsidy for that connection. And that would mean that we're not kind of artificially having to do all these separate projects. You can just say, all right, if I know that I'm going to get $400 per household, I can then, in the communities that I know, go ahead and do something. Because at the moment, the World Bank has this, them and Rockefeller want to build some ludicrous number of mini grids by 2030. The fact that it's now only 4 years to 2030, not the 7 years that they had initially when they thought of this. It's something like 200,000 mini grids by 2030, which is clearly never going to happen because they've only started doing it in 3 different countries. But in those 3 countries, again, they've had kind of consultants come up with the design for a mini grid, and then they tender for local developers to build those mini grids, which of course means it's incredibly slow and you end up with a mini grid that doesn't really work. If they just said, all right, in these countries, build whatever you want, anyone that connects someone, $400, this thing would go an awful lot quicker. More open access in data. So there's a lot of government and philanthropy funded projects, and then everybody keeps all the data for themselves. So we still don't actually have really good data on actually what are the household loads in different countries and in different situations. You know, what sorts of shops are in a rural community? You know, if you bring energy in, what sort of shops can you expect to have themselves? And there's, you know, sure, private organisations want to hide their intellectual property, but it's fine to do that if it's kind of how your technology works. But if it's something very basic, like what's the household load, or what shops are the community, what businesses are there, and that's being paid for by public funds, I don't think it's unreasonable for that sort of data to be shared more widely, because it would make life an awful lot easier for everybody else. Regulation bottlenecks and a bit more long-term. There we go.